Here is Pennonia Tihanyi Purple. As a purple, this is much lighter than I really expected based on the swatch. It passes some nice resistance, which gets foreshadowing when you look at the chromatography. This gives a very consistent light purple tone on all papers through the writing samples. It's also very consistently shades on non-fountain pen friendly paper. It shows no aggression and generally performs as well as it does on the premium papers, making this a good ink for students. Though everything about this ink is good, I didn't enjoy using it, not at all. So for me, this is going to be a hard pass.
The pen for today is a TWSBI Eco. And now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how we got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
This is a lighter than mid-tone purple, little bit lighter, but still easily read on the page. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it does shade fairly well. You get to see it in a bunch of words like anti-symmetric. Pause for a moment. I thought I was saying a different word. I was very shocked for a moment. The A is darker than the N. It gets darker again at the TY, lightening up quite a bit at the S, becoming a nice mid-tone with the YMME. But the trick at the end does get a bit darker. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Pennonia makes more than just one ink. Let's take a look at a few other inks from Pennonia.
Here is Pennonia Zodlike Greenfinch.
Here is Pennonia Storm Cloud.
Here is Pennonia Bubblegum.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread. It does have some shading, but it's very light, not as standout anywhere near as it was on the Clairfontaine, but it is present. Consider less. Consider on the third line is, in general, a lighter word than less on the fourth line. But even consider has a little bit of shading in it, where the C is darker on one end of the word, and the der at the end is a little bit darker again. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors, making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. Now the fact that the tone does not change means what we have is an opaque ink. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread. It does shade as if it's reflexive for this to do. Look at reflexive on the second line, where the REF are a nice mid-tone. The TEX do get a little bit darker, and the IV lighten a little bit with a dark E at the end. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, the smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, does shade almost as well as it does on the Clairfontaine. Most importantly, it does stand out against the quad rule with no problems, allowing the quad rule to melt into the background after you used it for your writing or whatever in your notes, making it a good ink if this is the type of paper you go for. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more violet or purple inks.
Here is Color's Pillars of Creation.
Here is KWZ Iron Gall Violet No. 2. Here is Noodler's Concord Grape. Here is Sailor Studio 235.
All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a Composition Lab notebook.
Here the tone is the same as the Clairfontaine, just a little bit flatter as a tone. Now, it doesn't feather, doesn't spread. It does shade that you can find. Look at that on the third line where the T is light, the H gets much darker, the A lightens up where a darker T at the end. But most of this writing does not have a ton of shade. However, most of it is fairly readable with no problem, like however on the first line. I still think this stands out against the quad rule on this paper very well, making it a good ink for students. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page.
Here is Private Reserve Foam Green. Here is Geherban Grise Nuage. Here is Sailor Pêche. Here is Diamine Amber.
The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine, and I'm going to leave the side by side because look at this. We get no feathering, but more to me, no spread at all. That is awesome on this paper. Normally, we're going to expect a bit of spread. We get none of it here. Those two right there mean we've probably got a great ink for you to use on 20-pound copy paper. It does have a light bit of shading, but nothing that stands out in any kind of real way. Mostly what we get is a fairly uniform, lighter purple tone. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding, no ghosting. Absolutely an amazing ink for 20-pound copy paper.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The dry fine of the TWSBI Eco gives a very consistent light purple with plenty of shading. Now off camera, I tried this in a wet broad. The tone did get much darker, but still not as dark as the swatch. Also, it maintained its shading. I would say the darker version was nicer to see. So I say go for a wet medium or broad to get the darker version than what is seen in the writing sample and still have the shading.